channel, the videos. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. I know it's a little bit early for a lot of us who would like to do like academic things, let alone like non-academic fans and furries and scholars. My name is Brandy J. Lewis. I am a PhD candidate at the University of California, Riverside. And today we have a great, amazing panel of furry fans who are also academic or academics who are also furries, doing different projects, doing different directions in terms of their research, coming to you today to discuss what they're drawn to, what they're working on, and why maybe furry can have an academic aspect to it. And so how today is going to work is we're going to go through introducing our panelists, and then we're going to go through and do some discussion with prepared questions. Towards the half hour, the last half hour, we're going to do questions and answers. So if you do have something you want to toss out to the panel, by all means, let us know. But let's go ahead and get introductions started. So I actually want to start with Theory, if you wouldn't mind starting off and giving us a little bit of background about who you are, your pronouns, what work you do, and then we can move down the list after that.
That sounds great. So hello, everyone. My name is Theory. You may also know me as Laura Kim. My pronouns are they, them. I'm currently an MFA candidate at the Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD, in Providence, Rhode Island. And I'm in the grad program in sculpture there. And I'm actually in my last year, so I'm really excited to kind of start finishing up my thesis and working with, my work has been and research has been related to queer of color performance, and kind of like more recently I've been looking into like the production of more life for queer people of color, queer trans people of color who use kind of like furry technologies or fursuits to embody and kind of imagine these like better worlds for themselves. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you. Let's go ahead now and move to Vela, if you can jump in.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Vela. I'm a graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My primary focus is history and classical studies, though in the case of furry is primarily modern American history. My main writings have focused primarily on the origins and place of queerness within furry fandom, especially in relationship to fandom as a whole. Most of my paper was helping to relate it to basically how it found itself within 70s media fandom and carried on and became its own inherent entity as it's carried on to the present day. Nowadays, I'm not writing quite as much. I would love to get back into it. Frankly, more so now these days that I have a bit more time. My jobs are allowing for it nowadays. But frankly, a lot of my jobs for a lot of people is helping them find resources for their own projects, such as Brandy, for example, finding names and dates and all that sort of thing to help them with their own projects.
Thank you. And then, of course, we have Hazel with us. Go ahead, Hazel.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Yeah, I'm Hazel, and I'm at Portland State University in the School of Social Work. I'm a doctoral candidate, pretty much in my last year, and a lot of my work is focused on, well, queer and trans youth of color specifically, but queer and trans youth of color who just happen to have personas, if that makes sense, and thinking about just this broad question of like, what does the persona do for people like us who are queer and trans people of color? And thinking about movement, working with people like Theory, who have really done work in like when it comes to art and performance, and just thinking about how these things come together when it comes to us as furries, and how does it feel when we put on that fursuit head, or how does it feel to really embody our personas and so forth. But yeah, that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Now this is the part where it's like, oh wait, anxiety, now it's my turn. As I described, my name is Brandy J. Lewis. I am a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Department of English at UC Riverside. Currently, I am doing an internship with Special Collections and University Archives as I work on my dissertation looking at the textual history of the furry fandom. I'll get into my story a little bit as we get into the question or discussion section, but a lot of my work is looking at the fanzines that are held at the Eden Collection of Science Fiction and Fantasy at our campus, looking at the short stories, illustrations, comics, pornography, and trying to think about how is it that furry developed from a textual space, and in what ways does the textual enmesh with the embodied and performative, and how do we kind of how can we think about the furry fandom from its comic, fanzine, short story history? It means looking at a lot of older stuff, looking at old issues of Rowbrezel, Voodie, Yarf, Perversion, and then trying to think of what to say after I've looked at these things. Currently, I'm working on my first chapter right now, looking at comics, including associated student bodies and circles. But eventually, I'm going to move into transformation literature. And then, of course, moving further down the line, looking at anthologies such as Claw and Roar. Now, with introductions taken care of, I want to give a brief description about this panel, why it's here, why it's during the end of July at 10:30 in the morning on a Thursday. So whether or not furries recognize it, of course, there are groups like First Science doing work on furries and have been doing work on furries, but there's a small smattering of furries within the community doing research, doing doctoral projects, and trying to figure out terms and language and ways of knowing why or what they do. Why is it that I'm interested in cartoon animals? Why is it that I'm interested in transformation fiction, pornography to the certain extent of pornographic works? And so, as you can already see, furry is being taken in a multidisciplinary frontier, in a sense, not the best word, I would argue, but it's being looked at from multiple disciplines, multiple backgrounds. And of course, we're all trying to think about what are the possibilities that furry allows, but also what are the weaknesses that we recognize within the community, whether it's at conventions, online spaces, the literature and stories that get told. And so today's presentation is really to draw attention to that work, but also to have a discussion on what do we think about furry in some way becoming more academic, or if what does it mean to have the institution take a look at furry, but from within the fandom itself, rather than like some onlooker that is estranging and pathologizing fans. Now, I want to start the discussion off with the first question. We already touched on it a little bit with introductions, but what introduced you to furry at a scholarly level, and what research do you engage in terms of the fandom? You can run with that however you want. Start off from where you started from, or kind of what you're working through right now. But I think it would be nice to give those listening an opportunity to think about, like, where are you engaging furry, and maybe why you got started in that direction. And really, it's anyone's game in terms of who wants to get started here.
I can pop in. I think I have some slides up.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna go for it. So yeah, I kind of am hopefully here to provide like some sort of like art school perspective of sort of studying furry or furry adjacent concepts and theories through visual art, which is something I love. And I found I'm originally from the West Coast, but I've been studying at RISD, which is, on the East Coast in Rhode Island. And it's interesting to see kind of the difference in like the art scenes there and here, but also in like wherever I've seen, I haven't encountered a lot of in these kind of, in this world and circles, like folks who are looking at like the phenomenological aspects of being a furry, or like even fursuits as like a medium of artwork, like it's like sort of woefully understudied, I think, in the circles that I've seen, like this sort of like contemporary art world. So I've just included some images of like my research over the past year. This work is also super new to me. I've been in the past, I've kind of been yeah, just like working on sort of different sorts of sculpture, but this past year I've been super interested in exploring kind of like these furry adjacent sculptures, and like including inflatables. So this is like a still from a performance I did, and I made this inflatable by hand, and just kind of like inflated it with my own breath, and was kind of thinking about I don't know, just like creating this other being through breath, and like through this like imaginary, and I think that's something that I see in furry a lot, like this sort of like ability to create these impossible bodies, or these impossible beings, or like this sort of idea of impossibility is also really fascinating to me, as well as like a queer and trans, how queer and trans like embodiments can come out through these like forms and materials. Here's another couple images of like an inflatable, just like orca, that I was trying to kind of construct into this like queer like torso sculpture, and thinking about like even like top surgery, or this like sort of ways that we just like create these or like how we imagine our bodies, like our it's very hard for me to put words to it because it's so new to me, but yeah, I've been lately kind of focusing more on kind of this like trying to come up with this sort of like queer and trans vocabulary through the inflatable, through breath, and trying to link these sort of like synthetic and organic hybrid sort of sculptures and beings, and trying to create some sort of yeah, just some sort of body of work around that. I also included this quote from Joshua Chambers Letson from their book, After the Party, A Manifesto for Queer and Color Life. And I'll just read it super quick. We live in the face of historical and social conditions that produce an unjust distribution of death toward and exploitation of Black and brown life in queer and trans bodies, actively shortening Black, brown, Asian, Indigenous, queer, and trans of color life with alarming and mundane regularity. Performance is a vital means through which the minoritarian subject demands and produces freedom and more life at the point of the body. Minoritarian performance is what Nina Simone described as the art of improvisation within a fixed framework, working within limited coordinates to make the impossible possible. So I picked out this quote because I feel like it really encapsulates sort of like the why of like why I want to research furry in sort of conjunction with like queer and trans performance. I just think it's such a rich place for that. And yeah, and just like improvisation within a fixed framework is like, I think just something that furries do really, I don't know, like naturally, and kind of create all this beautiful like and fascinating personal visual art. So it's just something I'm really interested in, and hopefully will continue to incorporate into my academic work here at RISD. But yeah, that's all I got. I'll pass it on to whoever's next here.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'm always astounded by the texts, the books that get cited, the articles that get cited. And like, so like seeing After the Party, I'm like, that's on my bookshelf. It's to read list. Like it's over there. But like the power that I see like other fans have taking up outside scholarship and saying, wait, this could be a language for furry is just like astounding to me. Does anybody else want to jump in? I don't know, Hazel or Wayla.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in really quick. I think I'll start with like how I got into my work first, because I think it's like super contextual for what I'm doing. Like I am a doctoral student and I was like thinking about like, well, I don't know what to research. And then COVID happened and everything was just wild. And so at that point I was like, I've been a furry, been in and out of furry since like 13 years old, just, and I'm 33 right now or 34-ish. And so it's just like, as I was thinking about what I should study, I got really, isolated and kind of alone. And then I kind of turned to furry again in my life and got really into like VR chat and like thinking about like embodying it and then like thinking about embodying my persona again. And then I just kind of thought like, this is like what I enjoy and like, how do I think about this in my work? And so after like, going into VR chat for the first time, seeing my own like paws, embodying them and so forth, I just really wanted to think about like that feeling of what it means for us when we are, when we think about performance or these vital means, like, what does it mean for us when we feel these things, or how do we feel when we first take a step into the furry convention and see our peers and see our friends and see our, our other, the personas we see in front of us and like how we interact. And so a lot of my work really thinks about specifically the queer and trans people of color, like how does my experience as a racialized subject intermix with my experience as a furry, as a person who is also a doctoral student, and thinking about how all these things intersect and so forth. And so my work really kind of has a background when it comes to, performance. And also my background, I'm a trans studies scholar as well. And so I'm really trying to center, for me at least, I also, while COVID was happening, while I was, engaging in furry, I also was like, damn, I think I'm trans as well, and so thinking about like, what does furry do for me, at least thinking about, wow, this really helped me think about, me transitioning or me being trans and so forth. Also me thinking of myself as a racialized subject in an era where Trump was coming to Portland, where I live, and like thinking about like the protests here and all these things intersecting and thinking about how is furry helping me? How is furry supporting me? And how do these things all work together? And so I'm just kind of doing these interviews, these views, these kind of like going to furry conventions and really thinking about how I feel, how others feel when they're in these spaces. And that's kind of where my work is centered. And I have a couple articles coming out that are going to be talking about that. But yeah, it's been really great to think about Joshua Chambers-Ledson's work, other queer scholars of color who are doing work around, trans subjects, queer color subjects, and thinking about centering our experiences and our work and trying to kind of push back on this dominant perspective that furry is a white thing, that furry research, much like fur science, other folks are saying, we're going to look at the white subject or the default subject, which is assumably white, or the idea that when I take off my fursuit head, people see a white person and so forth. And so thinking that, really trying to redirect the orientation of who we're looking at and why and so forth, and who is being left out of these studies and so forth. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
Thank you for that. Did you want to jump in, Wayla, in your work as a historian and kind of going through the documents online or in person?
Yeah, I would love to do that actually. My work mainly got started when Fred Patton passed away. That was actually what caused me to pursue this more thoroughly, because at that point, I had realized that there was no one really pursuing a history of furry fandom, someone who was willing to catalog and record and kind of document, whether it's texts, whether it's interviews, basically things that would help to catalog what is furry and what are people's experiences with it. That wasn't happening when I was starting it. This was back in like 2017, 2018. And so I pursued this. This was during my undergrad. I pursued a paper, which actually I think I have it pinned on my Twitter right now. Basically, essentially talking about queerness in furry and why it came to be in the first place. A lot of my work, especially because I'm influenced by classical studies, have to do with perception and the power within it. Because when furry was originally started, it got a lot of its origins from science fiction fandom, which was majority white men and very straight. That was inherently what it was in the 70s and 80s. And so a fundamental change came about when it moved to the online space and people were able to find performance within furry that allowed them to explore their own queerness where they may not have been allowed to, especially with young college men. who were finding this online space and then finding the physical space of conventions to move to. But one of the things that I tend to focus on because of my background is how that perception of this new crowd was seen rather negatively and seen as essentially a corruption of what fandom was supposed to be. And how this sort of perception still continues to this day, especially when it comes to people of color within fandom, because they're become more and more of part of the furry space in the past 10 years, especially with the rise of social media. A larger group is exposed to it. And with that, they've come to become more prominent within this space and express themselves more within it. And so they've had to push back against that sort of perception. But frankly, that's one of the reasons why in the future I would like to do more interviews at conventions myself, is to talk about people's experiences with perception and how they've been seen, whether it's in online spaces or in conventions, and how they've come to not only understand themselves, but also understand themselves contextually within the space of furry itself. That's frankly where I see my studies going for further in the future, because originally I started simply with cataloging what had been with how it started from fandom in the 70s and 80s. But I would like to catalog what is currently happening now so that we have a record going in the future that scholars can study and potentially extrapolate from.
Right. And I think, so if you think about like scholars like Lisa Gittleman thinking about print and documents as the no-show function, kind of documents are used to produce a certain subject within society. You could trace how that history has moved to online spaces, simultaneously to larger conventions within furry. Like, how is it that constantly simultaneous textuality, but also performativity, we're always producing furry in new ways that are still tied to those histories in the past?
Absolutely, because inherently one of the unique things about furry is that it is so centered on the individual. That is what is unique compared to other fandoms, is that they're based on canon, essentially, of someone else's texts. But furry inherently, while it has an aesthetic that is based around the individual works and what people are fans of, are the works of themselves and others people. And to talk about the cataloging part, one of the things that you hear a lot about, I can think of like New York Times articles as an example, is I forget the exact term, where essentially it's the degradation of cataloging in online spaces when it comes to links, because things just aren't preserved. And that's especially true in the modern age when it comes to online spaces, because a lot of it simply isn't recorded. The same goes for conventions, and you'll see this historically, is that they don't catalog a lot of the goings on at conventions unless it's by one or two individuals. And for that reason, that's why I find it more important than ever to create that sort of record where it may not otherwise happen. And I say that because I'm a historian. That's the sort of thing I like to focus on.
Right. And if we could go to the next slide, I want to touch on that just a little bit. So like in my work as someone interested in archive theory, science fiction, fanzines, I got onto my campus like as an undergrad, not knowing what I wanted to do. But then like when I left undergrad, I was like, I want to study furry. Is that a thing that I can do? And then lo and behold, a year later, I got into my program for studying furry and trying to understand queerness of furry. But it wasn't until within the last couple of years where I realized that our archive, Special Collections University Archive, specifically the J. Lloyd Eaton collection at UC Riverside, has tons of furry stuff that was donated by Fred Patton and fans starting in 2005 after Fred had had a stroke. And what's interesting is when I asked the processing archivist, Andrew Lippert, like, how did these documents get here? How did furry get here? He explained that, well, Fred's documents were mostly, or in some part, distributed and given to the archive because of his history with science fiction and anime. Fred being one of the main members of the cartoon fantasy organization that got anime to be arguably what it is today. But interestingly, the furry stuff was not found until the archivists were processing the materials and trying to like figure out what is in this stuff and like where do we put it. And so when I got into my internship, and I was getting to meet the undergrads who are working in the library, because we have like mostly undergrads working there, along with the archivists and the librarians. One of the staff members said, we actually had to explain to some of the undergrads what you do and show them some of the works. And it was a bit of a surprise to them what furry is. And mentally, I was like, oh my gosh, I can only imagine why. But these documents, and it's I argue it's partly like what you said, Vela, like furry is so individual that it operates on a different understanding of culture that does not get recognized like in anime and sci-fi, in comics fandom. We're so entrenched in like the individual artist, creator, and story writer with our own kind of like inner community economy that it takes some work to find these documents, these traces, and like put them into terms that are useful to us, but also explain kind of what goes on to those inside academia, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Oh goodness, what was I going to say there? I'll remember in a second, but yes, you're definitely spot on with that.
Now, the next question I want to ask, just because we're kind of like tying in all the questions that I have as we're going, but as a fan, as a furry, do you find your work harder to do, easier to do? Do you find yourself in this difficult relationship with your subject? Because on the one hand, furry gets looked at as the weirdo at the window, laughing in at society's blunders. And being a part of that space, it's kind of like there's something like powerful about that. Like we hold a position where we understand what we're doing and why, but then there's also that like sensation of like, is this the right direction? Is this what academia needs? Like where do we sit, if anyone wants to start off?
I will actually go ahead and start off with that, mainly because my perspective is that being within furry makes it significantly easier to understand, mainly because you're not coming from this outsider perspective of this strange thing that I don't quite understand where they're coming from with it. Because contextually, there's a lot that you need to know before you can truly understand it. That's part of the reason why in my own writings, I start off by establishing a lot of context with basically how fandom started and the processes that it has, because you need to know those in order to understand how furry functions and why it is different. Because if you don't even understand what a fan is, it can be extremely difficult to understand what a furry is, and not just see it as kind of like a meaningless waste of time, because frankly, fans still get that, let alone furries. So in my own works, while I do see and I do understand that people who starting from furry can often glamorize it and not want to criticize it very extensively, I still believe, in my personal opinion, that coming from the perspective of being a furry is somewhat of a necessity. Maybe not entirely, but I would advocate for it, just because you are not biased against it just at the get-go. It's a better starting point to be at as an academic, because at the very least, then you can develop a more critical perspective. Right.
Thank you. Does anyone want to jump off that?
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, and I also wanted to offer, like, in my experience, which would, it totally differs, I think, depending on who, like where you go, like who you're working with, who your advisors are, but I've been super lucky in that art school has kind of like, because art itself is sort of this like very amorphous container for a lot, you can, especially in graduate school, a lot of your work is very self-directed, and I've found a lot of freedom actually to be able to explore these sort of aspects of like furry art with like some pushback, but in terms of like folks not really understanding where I'm coming from, or knowing the context of furry beyond, whatever the sort of mainstream, collective consciousness of furry is, which I can't imagine is very deep or has changed much in like the last decade or so. Or maybe it has, I don't know, my perception is totally removed from that. But if for folks, because I do know there's also a lot of just amazing visual artists who consider themselves furries as well. And it is kind of this woefully underrepresented, like there's just so much that someone could do. Like, you know, I'm like focusing on inflatables, which is like this sort of, you know, it's not even what I think folks would think of immediately when they think of like furry visual art. But there's just so much to explore, so much to extrapolate from. There's so much, you know, theory and things out there that can be incorporated into this work as sort of like this conceptual grounding for visual art. So it's the difficult thing is kind of what Vela and Brandy were talking about, which is like just kind of being able to, you know, work on these like very niche or like get really granular with your studies while also kind of working with folks, like their perception of your work, or like and trying to get them to that place of understanding as well, which can be a little tricky and takes time. But anyway, I just wanted to offer that as well. Like art school has been you know, kind of freeing in that sense, that it can, you know, it can sort of take many different forms, which I appreciate.
Right. And just to add on to that, one of the things that when I was examining for my candidacy, one of the questions that I got was, in what way is furry cinematic? In the sense that we watch something and become an embodied spectator within the space, the mise-en-scene of, like, let's say a performance or cartoons or animation. And I think once we think about what is cinematic about furry, how is it that what we watch or look at is pieced together in some way, like a film frame or like a space that we have to contextualize ourselves within? That's a lot of furry history, and that goes way back to the 70s with Waller and Worley's like Omaha the Cat Dancer, where you have the comics where you have to stitch meaning together yourself as a reader. But with performance and the art, that just gets added to the upteenth level now, where rather than simply comics and illustrations, we have things like fursuits, things like inflatables that test meaning, but hold a meaning very importantly to the performer themselves. Did you want to jump in, Hazel, perhaps?
Sure. Yeah. This question's really interesting. I like it because, well, first I want to say, like, you know, the question framed like as a fan, like I don't see myself as a fan, number one, you know, if that makes sense. Like I come from a perspective of like furry being not like a fandom in my perspective, but the thinking about like, do I find your work easier or harder to do as a furry or as a self-identified furry? Like I am from social work, or my background is in social work, education, early childhood education, and thinking about queer and trans youth. And so right now in this field, in the more practice-based field, a field that's really trying to think about, well, how do we interact with queer and trans youth, especially during a time when in Texas and in Florida, these kind of policies are being passed to, you know, minimize, marginalize, and even, you know, destroy queer and trans lives. Like we're trying to think about, well, what is furry doing for these folks in that space? And so, at least in my perspective, there's a lot of curiosity of like, what is furry, or who are furries, but also at the same time, less about like, who are these furry people, but more about, well, how does this young person engage with the persona, if that makes sense, and what is useful. So I think when I'm thinking about this question, at least in my luck or in my perspective, in my experience, all of my, you know, peers or colleagues are just kind of like, do whatever you need to do. We just want to hear from you as a person who may know about this. And so again, like I think it's super important to have, you know, people who are furries or who see themselves as furries doing this work. There's been so many things I've read in my literature reviews that are from people who just are so kind of like looking from outside within. And even the folks from a very like liberal, leftist, like very like open-minded, progressive view that are saying the most interesting things about us in very curious ways, often, focusing on our sexualized aspects and so forth. And so I'm just really excited to really think about, as a furry, like it's just easier for me to really think about, I'm trying to engage more with, just the basic idea of like, what does it feel for me? What does it feel for all these folks trying to, fit into their fursuit, embody their VR chat avatar, or even draw and so forth their persona, and thinking about, even during my interviews, it's so fascinating to think about historical context too. So many interviews I've talked to folks where they just keep on describing, oh yeah, when I first read Associated Student Bodies, or when I first read Circles and so forth, and thinking about like how that contextualizes their curiosity into what it means to be queer or trans, what it means to transition, what it means to be in these poly relationships, and thinking of what that feels like, when it comes to social worker practice, it's less about this kind of granular theory and more thinking about, well, how does this create family for them? And what does that family feel like? And what does that family do for them? And also when it comes to a policy level or a level when it comes to teaching or doing social work, are social workers and educators actually understanding what furry is? Like, for example, I had thinking about this work and how it's easier for me, like teachers will come to me and be like, my student is drawing animal characters. Like, what do I do? Is this bad? Is this weird? And I'm just like, it's totally like, that's where we're at with education and social work. People have no idea what furry is, and they're getting all their information from CSI episodes, perhaps, and so forth. And so it's easier for me to do this work because people are just hungry for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that leads into a question that came up in the chat, but as well our kind of next few questions. Did you like have to quote unquote come out as a furry? That's kind of been something that haunts furry to this day, where because of the media, because of representations, because of meme culture, people feel as though being furry is attached in some way to queerness. But do you feel like when you started working on your projects, did you feel there was any hesitancy on your part, or maybe like you were going to be seen a different way? Because like for me, when I started grad school, I was in science fiction studies and I was very interested in furry, but I had to explain to everyone I knew what furries were and what furries do, except for the one gentleman who studies Godzilla and is in the know of like anime and sci-fi culture. He's like, oh yeah, the furries. And he starts shaking his head playfully though. But for you all, do you feel there's a hesitancy on your part to explain what you do? Do you feel like you're, when you came out, quote unquote, as a furry, your department responded in a certain way?
Like I'll be really quick. Like when I proposed my dissertation like idea, I like brought in my fursuit head and was like, I was like, it was in a way like me coming out to them. I was like, yeah, like this is what I'm gonna be doing. And so, but it was hard because I think for so long, it's almost like they knew first before I did. Like I was like trying to hide it. I was afraid, but they were all like, we get it. Like I think we know what you're doing. But I think it was like, it just depends. Like for me, I don't know, their response was really positive. They understood. I'm lucky. A lot of my community that I'm with, my advisors, they're all queer or trans people, and they kind of are like, or they have children who are kind of dabbling maybe in furry, maybe in warrior cats, maybe in this kind of world. So they're kind of like, oh, I get this kind of. And so again, like, coming out to them as a furry, or even coming at them as trans too, like it's been really supportive. And I felt lucky in that way, where they're kind of like, wow, we love this, and they're just kind of curious. But it was hard at first to really convince people to even explain to them what a furry is, because I've had many meetings where people were like, oh yeah, it's that sex thing, right? And I'm like, well, hold on, like, kind of thing. But I think I'm always having to translate. It's always a translation process with folks who are not in the know or who are not maybe like thinking about my work. And I'm always, when you're in it, I think all of us have done this maybe with our advisors, like having to constantly over and over translate what furry is and what this means and so forth. But yeah, that's kind of where I was at with that.
Yeah, does anybody else want to jump in off that?
Oh yeah, you can go ahead, Theory, if you want.
Oh, sure. I'll just real quick. I just wanted like echoing all of that too. And like, yeah, like just to share a little bit of my personal experience, like when I applied to art school, I was using like my previous kind of work is more centered around like this kind of like Asian like subjectivity. And I was using like a lot of or like mixed raceness as well. Like I was using a lot of materials from like grocery stores and stuff. So like very, very different than the work with like inflatables. And I'm hoping to do some like kind of like fursuit performance stuff as well. But in a sense, like I haven't like kind of formed like come out to my department yet about this sort of shift in my work, but I've just been kind of doing it. And like I think having that confidence and like having this sort of like at least for me and like the school that I'm at has like they place a lot of or I mean like I think that they're very interested in sort of like queer theory and things like that. And so like I think being able to speak their language and like incorporate those like concepts and theory into the work. So it's not just like, you know, I'm just making fursuits or whatever. And they're like, oh, what's that? Like, there's like kind of like keeping that kind of like at the forefront of when I'm describing my work to others, I think really helps. And like, also just like the fact that there are more and more furry researchers like you know, pursuing these studies, I think actually really helps as well. Like just being able to collectively draw on each other's work and like, you know, like it's sort of like, I mean, like we're sort like, not that it needs to be legitimized or anything in the eyes of the institution, but it definitely helps to have this sort of community and collective work. Like everything that everyone's doing helps like just sort of build this this like I don't know, this like just collective grounding of research, theory, concepts, visual arts, everything. So I think that's I'm super grateful for that and hope that there'll be more of that as well. And also just like one final point, like just being okay with people not getting it too at first, you know, like it takes time to describe these things. There's you know, we have a lot of you know, just like depending like some studio visits I've had, like people were just like very caught up on like, they're like, oh, this is like a weird sexual thing, right? And I'm like, well, that's a part of it, but like, that's not what I'm, you know, there's so much more to it as well. And it just kind of takes time to sort of, you know, broaden the horizons a bit, you know, especially when it's a lot of work that maybe traditionally hasn't been done or seen, or like, you know, when people look at or think about like furry art or furry, you know, they think about like stuff on DeviantArt or whatever, you know, or like just like the layman kind of perception of that. And that's, you know, that's part of like, you know, people are at where they're at and it takes time and it's totally okay. Like, and as long as like, I think the most important thing I've learned is to just like keep going, keep following that sort of intense interest that you have, because that passion will also shine through, I think, to people. And like if you have like if you really care about what you're working on, and it comes through. So I think yeah, that's been my experience.
Thank you. Wela, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I don't have quite as much of a story for mine, mainly because I never really came out to my history department about this. The main person that I actually talked to, and actually, I actually did get credit for my paper that I wrote about furry history through this person, was the head of the gender studies department at my university. She was very supportive of it because I told her that I was just writing this in my spare time, and she said, "Hey, you might as well get it for college credit." And I said, "Wait, I can do that?" You know, so that was fun. But talking with her about that sort of thing was very much like, it was kind of an earnest misunderstanding, because she would show me Snagglepuss Chronicles or some other mainstream animal person comic and say like, "Is this furry?" And I said, "No, it's not." But she was like, "How do you tell?" And it's just like, I found it really hard to describe at first, because I just kind of like, I was like, "Oh, you just know." But it's like, wait, it's not within the social context of furry. You know, it doesn't have the same artistic motifs and the same purpose, you know, relying on people's identities, about relying more on their expression through a comic, for example. And so explaining that to her was kind of an enlightening experience, frankly, just trying to talk things through, because it helped me understand it better. which I think is ultimately a positive experience. And that's usually what happens when I talk to anyone about me being a furry. It doesn't happen super often. And frankly, it doesn't happen as much as I'd like in academia. But frankly, it has usually been a positive experience for me, thankfully, because they've just been curious. They understand, like, oh, you seem very interested and passionate about this. Why is that? You know, there's usually some kind of interest in understanding the why. And as an aside, I was noticing, who was it? Verslinks in the chat was talking about starting a furry club at their university. I actually did help that. That same professor was willing to sponsor a furry club for all the freshmen that just showed up one year, all at the same time. There's about 10 of them. I was one of the only furries on my campus, and then they showed up. And I was like, need help with the club? Here, go to this person. She's like, yeah, I'll do that. But that's about the limit of my experience with it. Thankfully, positive.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to our discussion on what was it? As fans, do we find the work easier or harder? And I think as academics and as academic fans, we struggle with whether or not we want to give dignity to our fandom or let it be what it is. Do we want to rescue it in the eyes of the institution, or do we want to sit with like the messiness, as Mark Manalan-san thinks, of what furry is? Do we have to explain it in a way that cleans it up a bit, which is like where I get into my work, thinking about like the pornography of furry. Sure, it's something that gets memed on the internet, but it's a very crucial, important part of the fandom in terms of people finding their queerness, their identity, finding ways in which they can celebrate themselves and survive in a world that's often dehumanizing for many different people, many different levels. But I think that's where I want to get to one of our last questions, since we're running low on time. We've talked about furry as the space that has different levels of academic power, has power for the individual, giving them a safe space, giving them a site for like self-development. But as fans and as fan scholars, or as artists and art scholars, do you feel furry still struggles itself in what it wants to be, what it wants to be presenting? Do you feel that there are things that maybe furries have to reckon with, or maybe kind of sit with as this work comes out, as fans within the space start speaking out on things that are happening? What do we think?
I think I want to start with this because I want to connect it to what we were talking about before. Sorry if my AC is loud, if you can hear that. I just want to say, like, as furries, collective, whatever fans we want to call it, like even the four of us all come to furry differently. And that shows in like our academic scholarship. And when we think about things like First Science, who I think have a conceptual understanding of what furry is, it's interesting to think about, like, as furries, we need to reckon with these things. I think we need to reckon with also, like, there are many ways we see or come to furry, like all of us may not agree on perhaps, like, what defines a furry? What does it mean for this to be a furry picture or so forth? And so that begins with, I think, what you're talking about, Brandy, of like messiness. Like, I think we need to reckon with what it means to be messy. And we need to reckon with, as scholars or as a community, like, do we need an essentialized point of what a furry is, what a fan is, and so forth? I think a good representation of what we're doing today is like thinking about how all of us come to furry differently, and it's letting that just be and exist in itself, if that makes sense. So if anything, I think furries do need to reckon with, I think, just like thinking about, what is the point of academia, of it being in these spaces, number one, like what does it mean to have authority on furry? And at the same time, in general, like thinking about furries and what, I don't know, it's just a failure. I don't know if they're failures, they're just kind of like these evolutions of what furries do. But it's just, thinking about, I think why I'm doing my work right now is like just giving voice or trying to give authority to furries who are always been marginalized in potentially oral histories, archival work, the hidden histories of furries of color, people of color in these ways, the ones who are not positioned up, who are forgotten about. And that is a failure, it's a history that has been projected by white furries and so forth. So those things come up a lot, I think, in works, and also just thinking about how we position ourselves with people who have apparently authority. That makes sense.
Right. Thank you for that. You wanted to jump in, Layla?
Yes, I actually wanted to piggyback on that because I don't have too much to add on that because Hazel has said all of it that I was pretty much hoping to say, and that we're still like dealing with that history of whiteness, which we essentially inherited from science fiction fandom, because that is kind of the lineage that furry is born from. For the simple fact of the matter is that a lot of that history dealing with people of color or trans folk or anyone of that matter simply was not recorded, which is why it's so hard to study for me, still going through the 70s and 80s, for example, because it simply does not exist, which is why I find Hazel's work so important, because actually wanting to catalog and record and understand, bring those voices up, is frankly the most important thing we could be doing right now. Like that's the sort of thing that I would support the most at this point in terms of modern furry history. And I think that's probably what we struggle with the most, besides talking about things like, oh, I don't know, talking about like consent in the fandom or things like that, but I would say, like, again, Hazel's thing is probably what I would want to focus on the most as well, just like acting and basically as support with that. Yeah, no, I mean, again, she said it best herself, so I can't really add too much more than that. That really is the key for it.
Yeah, same. Like, yeah, everything that both of y'all or all of y'all just said. And yeah, like I like wanting to reiterate that, like, that there is like trying to avoid this sort of like, I don't know, even like weirdly colonial process of sort of trying to like name or like exactly like categorize what furry is exactly is something that I think like I want to avoid. And like it's like not wanting to foreclose all these possibilities that furry does for folks. And like I always kind of return to the theorist Jose Esteban Munoz, who sort of championed performance studies and this sort of question of like what do these things do for people, like rather than like trying to figure out like what is furry or like what like why do people do furry things or whatever, like which I think are fine questions as well, but like what does this do for folks is something that I'm really interested in. And like yeah, and also just like another question in art school that I was asked was just like, who are you trying to protect? And I think that's like a question that I always ask myself periodically while going through these studies or this research and stuff, like who am I trying to protect? And I always think of like, queer, trans, people of color, like those are the communities, like sex workers, like, and so like my work is like trying to kind of revolve around those things as well, just in a sense of like just like what can furry do for folks who are like suffering, and like what have people done like to sort of alleviate or create these like or reimagine this world, like yeah, very, very great. Anyway.
Yeah, just to piggyback on all of that, funny enough, I'm a pig online. I think before we get into questions, there's this beautiful thing that I've learned with furry, which is that, and this is coming from like Dana Settler on the idea of reading sideways, lateral reading, that furry is not just this thing fans do and perform and are constantly shifting and changing as a result of what they create. But if we read laterally, we can see the pleasures, the pains, the possibilities that furries imagined simultaneous to moments of history, moments of loss, moments of pleasure. And so looking at furry, it's no wonder that it's been so useful to queer, trans folk, queer folk of color, disabled folk, because it gives this vehicle for telling your story, but also enmeshes you in this collective process of going through the trouble, to quote Donna Haraway, thinking about kind of what's happening in our periphery and like what do we do with that messiness.
Well
Now,
put, very well put.
Oh, thank you. Now let's go to questions and answers now. I know questions have been popping up in the chat. I've done my best to try to like enmesh them into the conversation. But what questions maybe do we have from the audience? Included on the slide here, this is one of the documents or texts we have at UC Riverside's Eaton collection. It's one of the very first science fiction magazines by Hugo Gernsback, Amazing Stories. And I think what's interesting about this is that in the early issues, Gernsback was very much similar to Furry, thinking about what is the lure of the text that we love? What are the possibilities of it? So you could still see that bleed from sci-fi into Furry, whether it's through fanzine history or like what we're doing today. Why do we study Furry? Let's see.
So feel free to post questions in the chat if you have any. And also, there's a couple of these slides I didn't get to, so I'll just kind of show what you have here too, because these are just great images while folks are thinking of stuff.
Thank you for going through those. Yeah, just, you know, as conversations go, directions change. These are some of the fanzine pages that I've taken photos of and gotten the pleasure of handling in the archives. I guess as we wait for questions, that could be something that maybe I throw out for all of us here. What do we think of in terms of like archiving Furry or doing the history work with Furry? Do we think that because fans, as somebody mentioned in the chat, citing Abigail DeKosnik, have rogue archives outside of the institution? But what do we think about like Furry materials being held by the institution? And is that something like could be useful to us? Or maybe like, okay, it's there, what do we do with it?
Oh, goodness, that depends on a lot of things. Because different institutions do things differently, naturally. It depends on how accessible they make these materials and, more importantly, what they end up doing with them. Some institutions, depending on the material that they have, will simply hold on to it and they will just have it in an archive and it will sit. And they won't really do too much with it. They won't make scans. They won't do anything else with that. And you have to, one, know it's there, two, request access to it. You know, and that's to say, like, yes, you could theoretically can access material and do use that for studies, but unless you are actively helping to make this known knowledge, it doesn't really prove to be that useful. So what I find more useful, if an institution is going to collect knowledge of this nature, they need to, one, make sure that they are having scholars to actively create materials from it. You know, so they're writing papers, they're studying it, they're talking about it, you know, they're bringing it to people's attention. And second of all, that the institution itself is creating scans and promoting it, saying like, this is our collection, this is what we have, here is why it is significant, this is why we're holding on to it in the first place. You know, this goes true for any sort of material that you have, but this is especially important for something like Furry, where usually in collections like this, they will be texts, there will be fanzines, there will be letters, they will be posters, you know, things of that nature that are visual or text-based that they can discuss and show people, you know, and say like, in this period, this is what people were doing. And this is why it's significant because they're showcasing this kind of behavior, so on and so forth. That is what I would expect from an institution in any case. And I'm talking as someone who does done archival work, you know, because if people don't know about it, it will not be as nearly as useful as you would like it to be, you know. So that's my point on that.
I see some really good questions in the chat if you want to address those ones.
Yeah, which one stands out maybe to you, Hazel? Like, is there one that jumps out for you?
Oh no, I was just looking at the one who came first. Toph, I think, posted one.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So how do you all feel your work has affected your understanding of your own identity? Any ways your Furry work has helped you clarify, explore thoughts about yourself? And that's open, whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah. Sorry. I think for me, like, wait, how has my work is so personal, I think, if that makes sense. My work is like so much about myself, also about others, but it's definitely my work almost made me trans. As weird as that sounds, I was like, oh, I'm gonna do this work. This is fun. Esteban Munoz, Amanda Lanson, all these queer theorists of color, like all these people I look up to. I'm just interested. The next thing I know, I'm like, I'm just like queer and trans, and my work has really helped me like, and also like forcing myself to really like, live like in my work and in my personal life just furry 24/7. And that has really helped me with like just me being myself. Now I consider myself like the most trashiest furry person I know, because I'm just like, it's really helped me really clarify and explore like just my own how I can come to this work and how I come to being a furry. So I don't know, it's been like amazing. Academia, or just this experience, this excuse to really work on furry is really just an excuse to work on myself. And I'm glad that it's kind of worked out that way, because then I get to meet amazing people, be with amazing people, and know myself in ways that I think are super interesting. So, but now I'm like a bunch in debt, so it's a good trade-off.
That's
Oh yeah,
definitely a mood.
oh,
Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Financially paid for my fursuit, or is going to pay for my future fursuit. So do that if you want.
I love that. Yeah, the college debt is very much a mood. Oh my goodness. But I want to say I'm very glad that your experience with finding your own identity through this is similar, because my studies literally made me trans, or figured out that I was trans, I should say. Because first of all, when I first started, that this was like late 2018, I said, you know what, screw it. I'm going to go to a furry convention so I can meet people and talk to them about this stuff. And by the time I finished my paper, I realized, oh wait, I don't think I'm, yeah, I think I'm trans. Shit, you know. And it was certainly a shock for me. It certainly helped that I was talking to a gender studies professor about this sort of stuff, you know, because they were continually questioning me in like terms of their own studies, which is helpful for my own stuff. But having some sort of context to what I'm a part of and what I experience within it, the fact that it's so based on individualism and performance, and the fact that it is a social group that I am taking a part of and experiencing with other people, and basically experiencing their own performances through this medium, if you want to put it that way, has helped me understand and appreciate myself more, frankly. Like, it's definitely clarified my own thoughts about kind of what I look for in life, kind of what tends to make me happy, simply put, you know, and because furry is fun, you know. This is the sort of thing that I find a lot of value in, especially when it comes to meeting other people and sharing experiences with them, you know. I mean, I think that really is the biggest thing, is that, you know, life with fandom in general, furry is a social thing, you know, because we want to share it with other people. And it very much introduced that to me, and as aside from my identity, as assisted in that as well. And that's fairly significant, I would say.
Absolutely. I'm just kind of echoing what has been said already. But yeah, I think like for me, like I come from kind of like a low income background, and go like still having like, you know, a lot of privilege to be able to go to higher education, which I'm super grateful for. But like, so like honestly, like studying and going to college has also been kind of a mode for survival as well, because it allows me access to like student loans, for example, like being able to support myself, you know, kind of through these ways. But so being able to study these things also in academia just makes sense for me, and also is really like the only chance that I get to really think deeply about these things, other than, you know, like the break. I took like a 5-year gap between undergrad and grad school, and it was just, you know, just the capitalist grind, and like that is just, you know, it's just not a conducive environment for really like being able to sit down and think about things. Yeah, so I really owe it a lot to like just having the space, even though it's kind of like you know, the academia is kind of just holding me for now, like, and soon it won't be, but just being able to have that space to explore like identity, affect, like it's all, yeah, it's definitely, I mean, getting into visual art in the first place was a way for me to kind of like understand and reconcile like my queer mixed race identity to begin with. And like, I'm really grateful that I'm able to like continue to do that in these like different exciting ways, and also bring in you know, to study things that I'm interested in, and can like be able to draw on this sort of community of visual thinkers and makers. Great question, but
yeah, thank you for all those responses. Jumping from like these last couple of responses, there's a question that I think really stands out, which is, what do we think about that tension on working with Furry between mystification and clarification? And like, so ASCII in the chat poses, a lot of y'all are focused on archiving and demystifying the history of Furry. Theory brought up how Furry takes many forms and is kind of shapeless in that way. What do we think about this? As we've just described, Furry has been useful in helping us find our identity and kind of help us survive through academia for one, but also like life itself. But what about this tension between sitting with the trouble and the messiness of Furry, but then trying to as well clarify it? Where do we sit with that?
I think a good example I can use, and this is just, it's an interesting way of phrasing it, but I compare it to something like Zen, where it's not about so much defining the thing, it's about defining what it does. We talked about this a little bit earlier, Brandy, but we don't necessarily have to clarify what Furry is, because you cannot define every single aspect. There's so many ways that Furry can be, essentially, you know, and we don't necessarily have to clarify it in the sense that we define what Furry is, but we can define what it is that it's doing, why people are into it, you know, and kind of the context around it, you know. God, I'm trying to think of more specific examples than that, but that's kind of how, in my own mind, I relieve this duality, in that I bring it into a oneness. You know, it's kind of, it's not how a lot of us might not be used to thinking in those terms, but that's how I kind of resolve that at the very least, because it is so focused on individualism, we can focus on all these specific examples, even though there might be like a one definition for the whole. You know, it just, through all these different examples, they were able to find clarification, even though you still have this mystification, quote unquote, or really this kind of, I think messiness is frankly a better term, because it is messy. Humans are messy. But that's an okay thing to deal with, because that's human nature, you know. And I see that a lot, for example, when I do my own studies in classics, dealing with, the 4th century, for example. There's just a lot of messiness when it comes to religion, for example, and how people, saw gods. The same goes for how people see themselves and how they perform in Furry. There's so many different ways to do it, and that's okay. You know, that's what makes it so unique.
I think this question hits at like ethic, like my own ethic of how I approached my own study. Like, I don't consider myself a scholar on furries. I don't consider myself studying furry. I consider myself a person studying queer and trans youth who have happened to, have a persona perhaps. And so I think it's, and personally, it is impossible to clearly explain furry. I think it's impossible to simply define furry, if that makes sense, or to clarify in some way. So my goal isn't to clarify, my goal is to almost explore mess, or to think about mess, or to sit with mess and really think about, and to really just sit and feel, as I think Brandy has talked about before, is like this continually evolving thing. Because the moment we kind of like put our eyes onto it and try to simply define or clarify, it immediately begins to marginalize and exclude people who may be outside of those margins. And I think, we talked about Munoz, Manalance, and other folks, but I also want to talk about, I think Theory used this term earlier in the presentation, like a furry technologies, from a term that's been derived from like Yerf, who's a furry scholar who talks a lot about this kind of work, I don't know. It's like, it's hard to really think about like what it means, even like archival work. Like, I don't really know if we could ever even think about collecting ultimately what it is these things are in some way, you know, like the parameters of what would even be included or excluded or sit within is so hazy that I think that even as a scholar, I just debated like, I don't think I even want to study furry. I just want to think about it and sit with it and kind of exist in it as every second it's changing and so forth, you know, if that makes sense. I don't know, that's where we're going with this, but that's kind of where I thought we were kind of headed.
I could not put it better than that, honestly.
If Laura or Theory, if you could go to the next slide. Yes, right there. So one of the things that I sit with as I'm trying to handle, and this touches on like another question that came up, which is like, how do we deal with the mystification or clarification of furry, but also questions of like racialization and race within furry. And I think, so it was put out on the Ash Coyote's documentary, The Fandom, that Ken Cougar Sample was somebody who started the practice of using personas as this way of representing the self. And for me, I'm thinking about all the ways in which furry is like, there's this powerful way of thinking about Blackness within furry, how it cannot be explained or taken from others. And yet there's this possibility and potential there that Black furry fans can utilize as they find spaces for survival. And so like thinking about Cougar and how in early sketches, there's no real comics where there's a linear narrative from one panel to the next. Cougar does illustrations, and part of that is looking at the character, seeing what it means to be furry and to kind of exist in this space. But also there's this inaccessibility we have with the character because we can't access or explain what this person or character is. That's up to the creator themselves to either let us in or not. And so there's like an opacity, I think, to the work that Cougar really brings out. And I think we often forget, like, furry was made in alongside history. And yet these practices get consumed within the idea of furry, when in actuality, like, these are survival strategies that a lot of people use and have used for centuries, decades, however we want to describe it. But I think Cougar's work is a beautiful way of thinking about how do we explain furry, but particularly furry from a particular subject's experiences and history.
Yeah, I think on that note, I just want to like promote, I guess, this idea that me and Theory are talking about. With me and Theory, we think about this a lot, and just thinking about what you just said, Brandy, this idea of like, you know, doing my interviews, talking with queer and trans people of color, and like we're thinking a lot about like just, you know, bringing more life into this world. Like for so many folks who are maybe racially more marginalized because of their queer and trans identity, like furry is life-giving, especially in a time of like immense queer annihilation, immense queer silence and violence. Like in my experience and my research, like youth are going to VR chat. Youth are going to furry to have a life that is more livable. So if anything, furry is this thing that we're seeing that, you know, in our history, in our archives, but even as now, the influx of politics that are happening in this world, people are going to furry to live, as what the theory would talk about, impossible lives, or lives that people were thought would be impossible before, but now are possible through furry, if that makes sense. So thinking about Ken Sample or people who are now, like, what's so exciting to see how we are each coming to furry, but how we each are giving ourselves more life in this time when we are so excluded of life, if that makes sense. So yeah, I just wanted to put that in there for fun.
No, that absolutely does. I mean, oh goodness. I think frankly, if there's anything that's missed in terms of how does furry make you feel, the context of it, that like just the outsider perspective doesn't get, is that specifically, is that it literally makes it more livable for you, you know? And that's arguably probably like one of the most critical parts about furry in general, is that it is that performance and identity through that creates a sort of environment for people, you know? And frankly, there's even some people within furry that don't necessarily even realize that's what it's doing, you know? And yet for a lot of people, especially for people who are, you know, people of color, that is a lifeline for them. having a group, having a community, having a place that they can just simply exist and be themselves, you know, like that is arguably like the core, the critical piece. So yeah, Hazel is definitely on point with that.
Yeah, and just really quick, like just type into Google anytime. Just type into Google "furry saved my life," and you'll see so much on that for sure.
There's so many examples, like, oh my God, it's kind of amazing.
Yeah, one of the things that I sit with when I'm going through these fanzines myself is like these fanzines, Amateur Press Association documents like Raoul Brazel, they were not just a place where fans were like, what do we like about funny animal characters? What do we think about Bugs Bunny and Fritz the Cat? They were also places where people were like, sorry, I haven't responded. I just had a child with so-and-so. And then the next zine, people were congratulating them. But then also you have folks like, in the case of Ken Sample, so in issue 4 of Raoul Brazel, which my archive does not have, sadly, artists did work that was too adult for the fanzine because artists were arguing like, this is not what we want here. And calls for censorship by the editor were made. And yet it was Ken who used his Puma character in the corner like mailing header and stated in ways that are resonant with Derek R. Spires and this a practice of citizenship, where Black folks would use pamphlets to try and create their own models of citizenship and discuss like what they wanted within their spaces. Ken argues like, if we're going to be this democratic space, we need to entrust in the editorial process, but not take up censorship as a way of silencing others. And so there's all this power and way in which the fanzine now blends in very messily, but also powerful ways with today, where sure, you have Twitter, you have all these online tools to use, and yet constantly furries are A, practicing fandom in their own way, but then also B, trying to imagine what is a better way of doing fandom, what is a better way of doing furry that continues to consider those who are disabled, those who are of color, those who are queer or trans. And I think that's something that furry needs to recognize is part of one of its most powerful aspects. Now we have time for probably one more question. Let's see. So this one kind of ties into an earlier question that we discussed, but how much engagement do you get at academic conferences on your furry and fandom research or panels? If you haven't been to an academic conference, maybe what kind of a engagement do you get from furries when you tell them you study furry literature, practices, performances?
Conferences. I presented some conferences. It seems good. It seems fine. I'm like, yeah, great. You know, furry. Everyone's like, that's fun. And great. But you know, it's been great, I think. And even, you know, me and Theory are actually presenting on a panel at ASA, American Studies Association conference, and later this year in New Orleans. So it's like it's starting to kind of happen, if that makes sense. But recognition seems to be happening in some way, even getting published, conference, whatever. Like it's happening, I guess. But that's just in my own experience. What about y'all?
I'm pretty new, or like I feel like I'm still pretty early on in my academic journey, so I don't have a lot of experience with it yet. With yeah, kind of like conferences and whatnot. But I have noticed, at least with just kind of observing, that folks like, yeah, like usually are at least like kind of in the circles of like that I've seen, like in sort of like queer scholarship and whatnot, like people are definitely open to learning more about it, because there is something also just about furry and like even like visually and the aesthetic, like, you know, certain aesthetics of furry that are just very striking, like visually, and like the ideas and concepts around it are very like just interesting, you know, to like even folks who don't know about it or have misconceptions about it. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more like kind of work and presentations and stuff that are addressing furry directly.
Yeah, my experience is limited, but I have been to at least one or two. The main one that I'm thinking about right now is a fan conference. It was also hosted through Zoom. This was during 2020 during the pandemic, I believe. And they were fairly receptive to it. I mean, I was the only one talking about this. A lot of them were talking about a wide variety of different subjects. So they were most definitely open and accepting to having this sort of presentation. As far as how common it was and, you know, whether they were actively seeking this sort of thing, I don't know. I don't know them well enough to know kind of their usual clientele. But as far as I could tell with that particular conference, my presentation was well received. I mean, they seemed to enjoy it and they had plenty of questions for me about it. So I can only say so much, but I seemed well received and it was fairly positive in my own regard. So.
Right. I think for me, I've mostly spoken at science fiction conferences, conferences where I can talk about like animal studies. And anytime I bring up furries, it's a mixed bag between one or two questions or silence, because not a lot of people know what furries are. And those who do know are more interested in like the post-humanity of it, thinking about how we test and redefine and explore and experiment with the human as it's understood as a concept. But I think this now leads kind of to something that just came up in the chat. One of our final questions for today. How would you like to see furry academia develop, perhaps kind of sitting with this here, and advance in the future? Would you like to see maybe more furries take up scholarship to explore their experience of furry themselves? Would you like to see maybe furry become something that's thought well of within academic spaces? Maybe take it any way you want.
I can start with this one. Yeah, what a great question. All these questions have been great. But I just want to see more. Like I just think that there's so much potentiality that furry just contains, especially as you know, we kind of talked about how furry is sort of this like messy amorphous thing, which means that it can you know, take so many forms, and there's so much potential for like subjectivity to be injected alongside research and art making. And yeah, I just want to see more. Like I would love to see, you know, just like an academic paper on, you know, Mike and Melissa, you know, or just like you know, just like or just like people just full on studying these like things that are interesting and like perhaps even like, you know, quote unquote lowbrow things or whatever, which we know is a total loaded term. But I would just love to see more of that. And like I would also love to see more like folks from marginalized backgrounds engaging in this work as well, because there's just so much potentiality. I was thinking about like Hazel and I have been studying like Zakia Iman Jackson. I might be saying their name wrong, but and how sort of like this you know, this the history of like colonization and dehumanization of like Black folks has and how that could relate to like anthropomorphism is just like such a like hugely rich concept just in that, you know, like little slice there, and like how folks from other you know, identities also you know, use furry technologies or use furry like aesthetics to work through identities and to imagine new identities, new bodies, is just like, it's such a rich plane. And I just want to see as much as I possibly can. Like, I really just hope that folks will just kind of yeah, and even if you I also want to mention, like, it is like a privilege to be able to go to university, and like that it's possible also to study these things without paying thousands and thousands of dollars and getting into debt. It's more difficult, but there is, I hope it doesn't stop it. Like, people don't think that they have to go to a university to do or be interested in this type of work, or like, yeah, to create art, especially. Like, I just hope that they'll find a way to do it, and know that there's a community here that will support that. And I'm also thinking about like Fred Moten and like Stefano Harvey's like the Black Undercommons, and thinking about like working within and against the university, because we know the university is an institution that's built on colonialism. It's built on this kind of like neoliberal sort of like gatekeeping of information sometimes. And it's something that we have to contend with as academics, and something that we're just like, it's a complicated thing. But I think I just encourage folks to, in any way that they see possible, to engage with it, because you definitely can, and there's definitely space for you.
Theory. We've talked about writing that Mike and Melissa paper. Let's just do it.
Yeah, let's do it. We got to do it.
Oh yeah, you gotta
gotta
do
do
that.
it.
That would be amazing.
Does anyone want to collab? Yeah.
Like that was like years. We gotta do it. But anyway, but I want to echo what everyone said. It's so beautiful. I just want to add like one tiny thing to that, which is just like what is it? Like, like, yeah, like the university isn't built for us either. Like, I think that's one thing to make note of. Like, it's just like, especially for queer and trans people, like, it's just like the university is, it's a confined space that, if anything, is trying to declutter mess, And so I'm just trying to think of like, how do we make a mess of the university? And everything Theory said has been, I think spot on. So thank you for that. I just want to say also, like, I was supposed to say meow once, so I'm going to say meow meow.
Meow meow. No, yeah. I agree with both of these. I really don't have much more to add to that, because that's very well put.
Now, thank you all, of course, panelists, for your time today. Thank you for your amazing thoughts, for sharing this, for getting a chance, of course, to think with Furry. I think it's a beautiful chance that, like, out of the pandemic, which is still going on to this day, like, it's still a thing, we found a way to work through it, and to like take care of ourselves by existing within the space that is Furry in a way that we find potent or powerful for us. Before we go, however, the chat would love to know, where can we find you or your work online? I would say maybe drop your Twitter, a website within the chat. I dropped my Twitter. But yeah, just let the chat know where they can find you.
Yeah, no, I have a Twitter. I posted in the chat. It's Vela Aurelia 64. My pinned tweet has the main paper that I've written in it. It should be on Dropbox. So if you have trouble accessing that, let me know. Otherwise, I'm freely available. I'm always happy to talk about anything history related.
Same. I posted my I'm just Himbo Theory on Twitter, and also down. Feel free to DM me about any questions or anything you have. I'm an open book.
Yep, I put myself in the chat. Really Tired Cat on Twitter, my website. Feel free to DM, contact me if you're a queer and trans person of color. I'm also looking for more interviews, so come on by. I got so many I want to talk to you. Other than that, yeah, thank you so much.
And before I close this out, I do want to thank the University of California, Riverside, for allowing me to show and share photos, scans of the fanzine and fan magazines shown here on the slides. The Eaton collection is a public library or special collections. So what that means is you don't have to be a student to look at the furry materials you've seen today. You don't have to be a student to hold a first edition Fahrenheit 451 covered in asbestos. Like, you can go show up to the reading room and they'll help get you set up. And you could spend an afternoon or even a day looking through patents papers, old furry fanzines. We have the first issues of Rowbrizzle there. And so if you're local to Southern California and you want to look at some furry history, by all means, take a chance, drive by and visit special collections. My Twitter is Brandy J Lewis. J is Jay for my Twitter username. By all means, if you're curious about studying furry, if you're in academia and you want to know more about the archives that the Eaton collection has, or what it maybe might mean to study furry, by all means, send me a DM. I'd be happy to respond to you. But thank you again to our lovely panelists. We have Hazel, Vela, and Theory here. I hope you all stay safe, stay cool, because summer is summer. But also keep doing the good work, keep putting your voices out there. I think as academics, whether we're in a university or not, we have a way of showing the community that what we do matters and what we do has history behind it and some political connections. And so by all means, keep doing you, keep working on those projects. And I'm going to be looking for that paper, Hazel and Theory. I'm waiting for it.
You got it. And also shout out Brandy. Thank you so much for organizing this panel and just doing an incredible amount of work to make this happen. And thank you to everyone in the audience for showing up with so many great questions and engaging and just, yeah, being interested in this. We really, really love to see it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Brandy. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Brandy. This was excellent. Thank you all for coming.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.